The sun had barely crested the rooftops of London when a telegram arrived at Whitehaven Mansions. Hercule Poirot, comfortably ensconced in his chair, carefully unsealed the envelope and read the message with a frown of intrigue. The note was brief yet puzzling, an urgent request from the manager of Blackbourne's Bank, one of the oldest financial institutions in the city. A sum of £50,000 had been withdrawn in full by a man who had been declared dead. 3 days prior, the Belgian detective's mustache twitched as he considered the implications. He turned to his ever-loyal companion, Captain Hastings, who was absorbed in his morning paper. "My dear Hastings, do you recall the case of the widow and the vanishing inheritance? An affair of mistaken identities and legal trickery?" Hastings looked up, puzzled. "I do, but what's that got to do with—" Poirot tapped the telegram meaningfully. "It appears we have a crime where the victim is dead before the crime. Even begins within the hour. They were seated in the austere office of Mr. Edward Langley, the bank manager. A thin, anxious man with deep lines of worry on his face. Langley wasted no time in recounting the extraordinary circumstances. "It was Charles Devonshire, sir," he explained, wiping his brow. "A long-time client. He came in on Monday morning, calm as you please, with his passbook and identification. Signed for the withdrawal himself." Langley swallowed, his face pale. "And then we learned from the newspapers that Charles Devonshire died last Friday." Hastings let out a low whistle. "But you're sure it was him?" "Absolutely," Langley insisted. "Several of us knew him personally." There was no doubt. Poirot steepled his fingers. "And the identification, was it examined?" Langley nodded fervently. Everything was in order. Signature matched perfectly. No discrepancy. Poirot leaned forward. "Tell me, monsieur, how was Mr. Devonshire found? This death, was it natural?" Langley hesitated. "That, detective, is where it gets stranger. He was found in his study, seated at his desk, appearing to have suffered a fatal heart attack. The doctor confirmed it nothing suspicious. His nephew, Richard Devonshire, has handled the funeral arrangements." Poirot's sharp mind turned over the details. "A man dies quietly in his study. 3 days later, he walks into a bank and empties his account. It was, as Hastings might say, an impossible crime, mis amis," Poirot said finally, his voice decisive. "We must visit the Devonshire home." The Devonshire home was a grand, solemn structure nestled in the quiet streets of Kensington. The curtains were drawn, the air thick with the recent memory of morning. A butler with a severe face admitted. Poirot and Hastings, leading them through a dark paneled hallway to a drawing-room where Richard Devonshire awaited, the young man, dressed in morning black, rose as they entered. He had the pale, strained look of someone who had spent days buried in grief and responsibility. "Gentlemen," he greeted, his voice steady but guarded. "I understand you have questions about my uncle's passing." Poirot inclined his head. "Monsieur Devonshire, I am most sorry for your loss. But as you may have heard, there is a complication." His dark eyes studied Richard with piercing intensity. "Your uncle was seen withdrawing a considerable sum from his bank 3 days after his reported death," Richard's expression did not change. If anything, it tightened. Yes, the bank manager contacted me this morning. I have no explanation. It's absurd. Tell me, Poirot continued, when was your uncle last seen alive? The night before he was found, Richard answered. I was here, but I retired early. Our housekeeper, Mrs. Pembroke, says she saw him in his study before she went to bed. Poirot gestured lightly. Would you be so kind as to permit us to see the study? Richard hesitated, but nodded, leading them down another corridor, too. A heavy oak door. He pushed it open, revealing a room frozen in time. Bookshelves lined the walls. A green banker's lamp cast a dull glow on the desk, and a single armchair sat by the fireplace. The scent of old paper and pipe smoke lingered. Poirot moved with careful deliberation, letting his gaze sweep the room. Hastings, standing by the door, muttered, "Looks ordinary enough, but Poirot saw what the ordinary I would miss." A single tumbler of brandy sat on the desk, untouched. A small stack of papers was neatly arranged beside it, but one sheet was missing from the middle. Poirot's fingers hovered over a slight indentation on the desk's surface, the faint outline of where something rectangular had once rested. A box, perhaps. Then there was the waste-basket. It had been emptied, but a trace of burnt paper clung to the bottom. Someone had destroyed something here, but why? Poirot turned to Richard. Your uncle's affairs, was he in any financial difficulty? Richard shook his head. Not at all. He was careful, methodical. He wouldn't have needed to withdraw such a large amount in cash, and the funeral arrangements who handled them. I did, Richard said firmly. The doctor certified the death. The undertaker collected the body, and the burial was 2 days later. Poirot's gaze did not waver. And you never saw the body? Richard stiffened. No, I preferred to remember him as he was. There it was the first crack. A careful deception, a misplaced certainty. Poirot filed it away, knowing that. The full picture had yet to reveal itself. Poirot let Richard's words settle for a moment, his sharp gaze never leaving the young man's face. Then, with a polite nod, he turned toward Hastings. Mon ami, I believe a conversation with the housekeeper would be most illuminating. Richard hesitated. Mrs. Pembroke? She's rather distraught over my uncle's death. All the more reason to speak with her. Poirot replied smoothly. Richard exhaled, then rang a small bell on the wall. Moments later, a woman in her 50s entered, her hands twisting the edge of her apron. She had a face that might have been stern if not for the visible wariness in her eyes. Poirot stepped forward with a reassuring smile. Madam, I am Hercule Poirot. I seek only to understand the events of that night. You were the last person to see Monsieur Devonshire alive, were you not? Mrs. Pembroke nodded. Yes, sir. It was about 10 o'clock. I had finished tidying up and was heading to my room when I passed by the study. The door was open just a crack, and I saw him inside. Poirot's head tilted slightly. And did he seem unwell? Distressed? She hesitated, then shook her head. No, sir. He was sitting at his desk, looking at some papers. He had a cigar in one hand. Poirot's expression did not change. But Hastings, standing nearby, frowned. "That's odd. We didn't see any cigar or ashtray in the study, Mrs." Pembroke's fingers gripped her apron more tightly. "Perhaps he finished it before." Her voice wavered. Poirot's tone remained gentle, but his words cut precisely. "Or perhaps, madam, he was not in that study at all when you last saw him." A sharp intake of breath. Her eyes darted toward Richard, who remained impassive. Poirot pressed on. "Tell me, when you found him the next morning, was anything out of place?" A pause. Then reluctantly, "His chair, sir. It was turned slightly, as if someone had moved it after he sat down." Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. "A small thing, but significant. And you are quite certain he was alone?" Another hesitation. This one longer. I believe so, sir." Poirot smiled, but there was something keen in his eyes. "Madam, you are most helpful. I have but one last question. Did Monsieur Devonshire receive any visitors that day?" Mrs. Pembroke's lips parted, then closed again. She glanced once more at Richard, who remained unreadable. Finally, she spoke. "A gentleman came in the afternoon. Tall, well-dressed. I didn't see his face properly, but he stayed for nearly an hour." Poirot nodded, filing this away. As Mrs. Pembroke departed, he turned to Richard. "You did not mention a visitor." Richard's jaw tightened. "I didn't think it was important. My uncle had many business acquaintances." "Ah, but business is often where the truth hides, n'est-ce pas?" Poirot murmured. He smoothed his mustache and adjusted his cuffs. "Come, Hastings. It is time we spoke to the doctor who declared Monsieur Devonshire dead." Doctor. Lionel Graves was a precise man, with silver-rimmed spectacles and an air of quiet efficiency. When Poirot and Hastings arrived at his office, he greeted them with cool professionalism. "I must say, gentlemen, this is most irregular. Mr. Devonshire's death was entirely natural." Poirot inclined his head. "Then you would not mind explaining the particulars?" "You examined the body yourself?" "Yes, the morning he was found, and the cause?" "A heart attack. No signs of struggle or distress. Quite peaceful, in fact." "Ah, peaceful," Poirot mused. "And yet, doctor, I must ask, did you personally know Monsieur Devonshire?" Dr. Graves blinked at the question. "Not well. I had seen him once or twice before, but we were not acquainted." Poirot leaned forward slightly. "Then how did you identify the body?" A flicker of irritation crossed the doctor's face. His nephew confirmed it. There was no reason to doubt, no reason at all. Poirot's voice was light, but his eyes held the weight of a hunter closing in. The doctor hesitated. Then, quietly, "I will admit, something struck me as odd. The body was cold, yes, but perhaps a little too cold for the estimated time of death. I dismissed it at the time." "Ah," Poirot whispered. "But now you wonder." A silence stretched between them. Finally, Dr. Graves sighed. "If you're suggesting some deception, I must remind you that the body was buried." Poirot straightened, his eyes glittering. "Yes, doctor. And now, We must ensure that it was truly Charles Devonshire who rests in that grave. The request to exhume Charles Devonshire's body was met with resistance, but Poirot's quiet insistence, paired with the bank's concerns over fraud, left the authorities with little choice. Late the next afternoon, as the grey London sky threatened rain, Poirot, Hastings, and Richard Devonshire stood at the edge of Highgate Cemetery, watching as the grave was carefully opened. Hastings, shifting uncomfortably, muttered, "I must say, Poirot, I don't relish this part of the investigation." Poirot's expression remained impassive. "Courage, mon ami. The dead often speak louder than the living." When the coffin was finally lifted and unsealed, a hush fell over the gathered onlookers. Then a sharp intake of breath from the doctor confirmed what Poirot had suspected all along. The body inside was not Charles Devonshire. The revelation sent a tremor through the case. Hastings swore under his breath, while Richard staggered back, his face pale as a sheet. "That's impossible," he stammered. "If that's not my uncle, then where is he?" Poirot studied him keenly. "A most excellent question, monsieur. But now we must ask another. Who is this unfortunate man buried in his place?" The authorities would need time to identify the body, but Poirot was not one to sit idle. That evening, he and Hastings returned to the Devonshire home, where Mrs. Pembroke greeted them with red-rimmed eyes. "I can't believe it," she whispered. "How could it not be him?" Poirot, his voice gentle, asked, "Madam, in your time here, did Monsieur Devonshire ever speak of a brother? A cousin, perhaps?" She frowned, thinking. "No, but wait." Her eyes flickered with uncertainty. There was something. About a year ago, he received a letter that upset him terribly. He locked himself in his study for hours. I overheard him muttering about a mistake from his past catching up with him. Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings. "Madam, did he ever mention a name?" She hesitated. "No, but the letter was signed with only initials, G.D. Poirot's little gray cells were now fully engaged. G.D. A connection lost to time, or deliberately hidden. If Charles Devonshire had been in hiding, that meant someone had been searching for him. And if someone had been searching for him, then, perhaps, they had found him. That night, Poirot spent hours reviewing every detail, arranging the puzzle pieces into a coherent picture. The bank fraud, the false burial, the mysterious visitor on the last day Charles was seen alive. It was all connected. But there were still gaps, motives that did not yet align. The next morning, he and Hastings paid another visit to the bank. Mr. Langley, still shaken, led them to his office. "I've gone through all of Mr. Devonshire's transactions," he said. "There was nothing unusual until that final withdrawal." Poirot tapped a finger against his chin. "Monsieur, I would like to see the exact signature on the withdrawal slip." Langley retrieved the document and slid it across the desk. Poirot examined it closely, then held it up against another signature from Devonshire's file. His sharp eyes narrowed. The writing was nearly identical, but there was something ever so slightly careful about it, almost as if it had been deliberately imitated. Poirot smiled thinly. "Ah, mon ami Hastings, do you recall what you once said about My signature? Hastings frowned. I believe I said it was so perfect it looked unnatural. Just so, Poirot said. And this, my friend, is a perfect forgery. Langley's mouth fell open. You mean? I mean that whoever withdrew the money was not Charles Devonshire at all, but someone who knew exactly how to imitate. His handwriting, a fraud had been committed, but it was more than just financial theft. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to stage Devonshire's death, take his money, and leave behind a body no one would question. Which meant someone had wanted Devonshire out of the way. That left the greatest question of all: where was the real Charles Devonshire? And more importantly, was he still alive? The discovery of the forged signature sent ripples through the investigation. The authorities wasted no time in pursuing Richard Devonshire, who, as the sole heir and nearest relation, stood to gain the most from his uncle's disappearance. His suspicious omissions, his presence at the bank on the day of the withdrawal, and his nervous demeanor all painted a damning picture. The newspapers pounced on the scandal. Nephew embezzles fortune from missing financier. And within hours, Richard was taken into custody. Hastings, watching the young man being led away, exhaled. Well, that tees it up neatly, doesn't it, Poirot? The bank gets swindled. Richard takes the money, and to avoid suspicion, he arranges for some poor unfortunate to be buried in his uncle's place. Simple enough. Poirot, however, remained uncharacteristically quiet, his gaze fixed on the bustling police station. Hastings frowned. Don't tell me you think he's innocent? Poirot finally turned, his voice contemplative. Innocent? Non-Hastings, I do not believe he is entirely blameless. But guilt, my friend, is a many-layered thing. Richard Devonshire has been dishonest, that much is certain. He has concealed information, and he has been afraid. But fear, Hastings, is not the same as cunning. Hastings sighed. You don't think he planned the whole thing? Poirot's lips pressed together. Consider, mon ami, the sophistication of the deception. A forged signature so precise that even the bank's officials did not question it. A body placed in the grave with no immediate signs of foul play. An entire crime built on the assumption that no one would think to check. Does Richard strike you as a man capable of such forethought? Hastings hesitated. Well, perhaps not. But then, who else? Poirot lifted his hat slightly, smoothing down his hair. That is what troubles me. The real criminal he is still watching, still waiting. And now he has seen his first great success. That evening, Poirot returned to Devonshire's home, moving through the study with a quiet intensity. Mrs. Pembroke, now wary of the police, hesitated at the door. I told them everything I know, she murmured. Poirot turned to her. Madam, you are an excellent housekeeper. I have observed. Yet there is order in everything you do. But tell me, was Monsieur Devonshire the same? She frowned. He liked his desk kept tidy. If that's what you mean. Poirot nodded and gestured to the papers still left in the study. Then explain, madam, why some of these files are out of order. She blinked. I don't know. I haven't touched them. Poirot delicately lifted one of the files and opened it. Inside was a letter, its ink slightly smudged. His sharp eyes danced over the words, and then he exhaled. Ah, Hastings stepped closer. What is it? Poirot's fingers tapped the paper lightly. A transaction. A transfer of a large sum. But not to Richard. Hastings's brow furrowed. Then to whom? Poirot smiled, but there was no warmth in it. To someone who, I suspect, has orchestrated this entire affair from the shadows. Hastings stared. You mean the real culprit? Poirot's gaze sharpened. Oui, mon ami. The true criminal remains unseen. And he has just won his first great victory. He has let Richard take the fall, and now he will feel safe enough to make his final move. Hastings swallowed. And what move is that? Poirot gently folded the letter and placed it in his pocket. To ensure that Charles Devonshire, if he still lives, never speaks again. The air in Charles Devonshire's study was thick with dust and silence. Poirot stood still, his fingers lightly resting on the edge of the desk as he stared at the papers before him. The room was a puzzle, and somewhere within it lay the answer to the crime. Hastings, watching Poirot's intense concentration, shifted impatiently. What is it, Poirot? You've found something, haven't you? Poirot's gaze flicked up. Briefly, his expression unreadable. Not found, Hastings. Remembered. Hastings blinked. Remembered? What do you mean? Poirot picked up the letter he had discovered earlier, the bank transfer that did not lead to Richard Devonshire. He unfolded it carefully, tapping the signature at the bottom. G.D., he murmured. Hastings frowned. G.D., the initials from that mysterious letter Mrs. Pembroke mentioned. Parcisement. Poirot's voice was quiet, but there was an undercurrent of excitement. And you see, Hastings, I have seen these initials before. Hastings stared at him. But where? Poirot held the paper to the light. It was many years ago, mon ami. A case long closed, but not forgotten. He turned suddenly, his eyes flashing. Come, Hastings. We have an old acquaintance, too. Visit the drive through London's damp streets was a tense one, with Hastings pressing for more details, but Poirot remained uncharacteristically reserved. They arrived at Scotland Yard, where Chief Inspector Japp greeted them with his usual gruff amusement. Back again, Poirot? Haven't you wrapped up this mess yet? Poirot smiled thinly. Oh, my dear Japp, how little faith you have in your old friend. I come seeking a favor. There was a case years ago. A banking fraud, a forged inheritance. It was buried beneath more sensational crimes, but it was never fully solved. Japp's brow furrowed. You mean the Jonathan Drake case? Hastings sat upright. Jonathan Drake? Another G.D. Poirot inclined his head. Indeed. A clever man, but one who vanished before he could be caught. Japp rubbed his chin. You think he's tied up in this business with Devonshire? Poirot's smile did not waver. Not just tied up, my friend. I believe he is at the center of it. Japp exhaled, pushing back his chair. Drake was a master forger. If he's resurfaced, we've got bigger problems than just Devonshire's disappearance. Poirot nodded. And he has made one fatal mistake. Hastings blinked. And what mistake is that? Poirot carefully smoothed out the transfer document. He believed that changing his name would erase his past. He tapped the signature. This is not merely G.D. This is Jonathan Drake, back from the shadows. Japp swore under his breath. That means he's still alive, still operating, Poirot stood. And I suspect preparing to strike once more. We must move quickly, mes amis. Before he removes the last obstacle in his path, Charles Devonshire himself, Poirot's mind was set. Jonathan Drake, the elusive master forger, had resurfaced, weaving his deception with practiced ease. But a man like Drake, no matter how clever, could not erase all traces of his past. There was always something, some overlooked detail, that would betray him. Poirot had seen it before, time and time again. The trick was knowing where to look. As they left Scotland Yard, Hastings turned to him, his brow furrowed. Poirot, you say Drake made a fatal mistake, but if he's as clever as you claim, how do you plan to catch him? He's already let Richard take the blame, and no doubt he's covering his tracks as we speak. Poirot adjusted his cuffs. Mon ami, the criminal always makes one misstep, not in the crime itself, but in his own nature. He believes himself too clever. He believes he controls the board. Poirot's eyes gleamed. But he does not yet realize that he is playing against Hercule Poirot. Hastings sighed. Yes, of course. But how do we get him to slip? Poirot smiled. We set the trap. They returned to Devonshire's home, where Mrs. Pembroke was fretting by the fireplace, her hands wringing her apron. Oh, Mr. Poirot, it's all such a dreadful mess. That poor Richard locked away, and now the bank's saying they may never recover the money. What will become of the estate? Poirot waved a reassuring hand. Courage, madam. The truth has a way of revealing itself. He glanced toward the study. Tell me, when was the last time Mr. Devonshire received correspondence? She blinked. Well, let me think. Oh, there was a parcel that came just before he disappeared. Strange thing, really. He took it straight to his study and wouldn't let anyone see what was inside. Poirot's mustache twitched. Ah, and was there an envelope? A return address, perhaps? She frowned. Yes, now that you mention it, there was. He seemed terribly flustered when I asked about it. I do believe he burned the envelope in the fireplace that very evening. Poirot's expression remained calm, but his mind raced. Devonshire had received something significant enough to rattle him, and he had hidden it. But had he hidden it well enough? He turned suddenly. Hastings, the fireplace. Quickly. Let us examine the grate. Hastings sighed but complied, kneeling down to sift through the ashes. Honestly, Poirot, if he burned it, what do you expect to find? Poirot's sharp eyes scanned the remnants. Then his fingers plucked a tiny scrap of charred paper from the soot. He held it up to the light. There, barely legible, was a fragment of ink letters, Woodhouse, Leam. Poirot's gaze sharpened. Leamington. Of course, Hastings. peered over his shoulder. "Leamington, what's there?" Poirot dusted off his hands. "A retreat, Hastings. A place of quiet and discretion." He turned, his voice low. "And if I am correct, the very place where Charles Devonshire is being kept." Hastings's eyes widened. "You mean he's alive?" Poirot gave a small nod. "Oui. But for how much longer? That, mon ami, depends on how quickly we act." Without another word, Poirot turned on his heel and strode toward the door. The game now fully in motion, the road to Leamington stretched before them in the dim afternoon light, the mist rolling low over the fields as Poirot and Hastings drove. In silence, Hastings, hands gripping the wheel, stole a glance at his companion. Poirot was uncharacteristically still, his fingers pressed together, his lips forming an unreadable line. Hastings knew this expression well. It meant that Poirot's little gray cells were whirring at full speed. "You're certain Devonshire is there?" Hastings asked. More to break the silence than anything else, Poirot gave a small nod. "I am certain he was taken there. But whether he still remains that is the question." Hastings sighed. "Well, I suppose we shall find out soon enough." They arrived at Linwood House, a quiet estate nestled on the outskirts of Leamington, its grand exterior softened by overgrown hedges and ivy creeping up the stone walls. It did not seem like a place of crime, but Poirot knew better than to trust. Appearances, a woman greeted them at the door, her expression wary. "Linwood House is a private establishment. Are you expected?" Poirot smiled politely. "None, madam, but we seek information. A gentleman, Charles Devonshire, may have been here recently." Her lips pressed together. "I wouldn't know. We do not keep records of our guests." Poirot's smile did not waver. "Ah, but you see, madam, I keep records of my own." He reached into his pocket and produced the charred scrap of paper. "This was found in Mr. Devonshire's study. It names Linwood House. I do not believe in coincidences." The woman's gaze flickered over the paper before she stepped aside, allowing them in. Poirot wasted no time surveying the sitting room, his sharp eyes catching small details, the faint indentation on the rug, where a chair had recently been moved, a smudged mark on the doorknob, signs of a struggle, or merely the movements of an anxious man. Hastings, meanwhile, was watching the woman. "We need to see the guest records," he insisted. "I told you," she said curtly. "There are no records." Poirot turned, his gaze piercing. "Madam, lying is a most dangerous game. I suggest you do not play it with me." For a moment, she hesitated. Then, with a sigh, she gestured toward the adjoining office. Hastings, triumphant, strode in first, Poirot following. But the moment they stepped inside, a sharp intake of breath escaped Hastings. The filing cabinet stood open, its drawers pulled out, the contents scattered across the floor. Some papers remained intact, but one section had been completely emptied. The records were gone. Poirot bent down, touching the torn edges of a folder. The destruction had been hurried, but thorough. Someone had been here before them. Someone who had known exactly what to take. Hastings turned to the woman. You see now why we needed to check? Someone else wanted to make sure we wouldn't find what we were looking for. Her face had gone pale. This is impossible. The records were intact this morning. Poirot straightened, his face unreadable. Then we must ask who knew we would come looking. A sudden gust of wind rattled the window. The air in the room felt heavier now, the weight of missing truths pressing down on them. Poirot stepped closer to the woman, his voice softer now, but no less firm. Someone is working against us, madam. The question is, are you working with them? The woman's throat bobbed in a nervous swallow. No, she whispered. But I think I know who might be. Poirot gestured for her to continue. His expression expectant, she took a deep breath. There was a man. He came asking about Devonshire 2 nights ago. I told him nothing, but he left with one of the orderlies. I didn't think much of it at the time, but now Poirot's gaze sharpened. Describe this man. She hesitated. Tall, well-dressed. A foreign accent, perhaps German or Austrian. He had a scar on his hand. Poirot's lips pressed together. He had heard of such a man before, in whispers and half-forgotten reports. Hastings frowned. Does that mean anything to you, Poirot? Poirot nodded slowly. We, Hastings. It means our game has just become far more dangerous. The air inside Linwood House was thick with tension. The woman's revelation about the mysterious man with the scarred hand had sent a shiver down Hastings' spine, but Poirot had simply nodded, as if confirming something he had suspected all along. Before Hastings could question him aloud, commotion erupted from the hall, a shout, the sharp scrape of a chair against the wooden floor. Then a gunshot. Poirot reacted first, moving swiftly toward the sound. Hastings was only a step behind, his heart pounding. As they rounded the corner into the dimly lit corridor, they saw a figure slumped against the far wall, his face pale and contorted in shock. A spreading crimson stain darkened the front of his vest. Hastings gasped. Good Lord, it's the doctor. Poirot knelt beside the man, his fingers pressing lightly against his throat. A deep frown creased his forehead. He is still alive, but we must act quickly. The doctor's lips moved weakly. Poirot leaned in, straining to catch his words. The records. Who did this? Hastings demanded, looking around wildly, but the corridor was empty. Whoever had fired the shot had vanished into the shadows. Poirot's eyes swept the scene with careful precision. The doctor's coat was torn, as if he had struggled with someone moments before the shot was fired. A door at the far end of the hall stood ajar, leading to the garden beyond. Poirot pointed. The assailant escaped through there. Hastings wasted no time, bolting toward the door and throwing it open. The cool night air hit him as he scanned the darkened grounds. Footsteps pounded away, but by the time he reached the edge of the property, the sound had faded. The attacker was gone when he returned. Poirot was already tending to the doctor, using a handkerchief to stem the bleeding. The woman who had spoken to them earlier stood in the doorway, trembling. I've called for help, she whispered. Will he survive? Poirot gave a small nod. He was lucky, mademoiselle. The bullet missed his heart. But tell me who else was in the house? She swallowed hard. Only the staff. And her voice faltered. Poirot's gaze sharpened. And she hesitated, then whispered, Mr. Devonshire. He was here, I swear it. But just before the gunshot, I heard movement from his room. When I went to check, he was gone, Hastings. Breath caught. You mean to say Devonshire has disappeared? Poirot's expression was unreadable. We, Hastings. And I fear he did not leave of his own accord. A heavy silence settled over them. One moment, they had been close to uncovering the truth now. Their key witness had vanished, and a man lay bleeding in the hallway. Hastings clenched his fists. Whoever we're up against, Poirot, they're not just covering their tracks. They're attacking anyone who gets too close. Poirot's eyes glinted with quiet determination. Just so, mon ami. And that means we must work faster. The game has changed. But Poirot, he is always ready. Poirot stood in the dimly lit corridor, his sharp eyes scanning the details as the wounded doctor was carefully moved onto a stretcher by the arriving paramedics. Hastings, still rattled by the sudden attack, paced near the doorway, his frustration evident. This is madness. Poirot, he muttered. Devonshire has vanished. The doctor is shot, and we're no closer to finding out who's behind this than we were at the start. Poirot smoothed his mustache thoughtfully, his gaze drifting to the spot where the doctor had collapsed. The blood stain was stark against the polished floorboards. Then, with a sudden motion, he turned on his heel and strode toward the study, where the ledger had been kept. Hastings hurried after him. What are you looking for? Poirot didn't answer immediately. He reached the desk, pulling open the drawer with precise, deliberate movements. The ledger was still there, but as he lifted it, his fingers brushed against something rough and uneven. Frowning, he withdrew a torn scrap of paper wedged at the back of the drawer. He unfolded it carefully, revealing a fragment of handwriting. Hastings peered over his shoulder. Looks like part of a note. Poirot's eyes narrowed as he examined the paper. The ink was smudged, but one phrase remained legible. Final request granted, payment to be made. The word struck an immediate chord. Poirot turned to Hastings, his mind working rapidly. Mon ami, do you not see? The pattern it is here. Hastings looked thoroughly confused. What pattern? What does that note even mean? Poirot tapped the paper. Think, Hastings. A bank pays out a large sum to a dead man. A doctor entrusted with confidential records is attacked. Devonshire, who may hold the missing piece, has vanished. He paused, then added meaningfully, and now we find a note referencing a final request. Hastings' brow furrowed. So you think this is about more than just fraud? Poirot gave a small nod. It is more than that, mon ami. The connections are too precise to be coincidence. Someone orchestrated all of this, someone who knew the bank's inner workings, who understood how to manipulate financial transactions. And yet, he trailed off, deep in thought. Hastings exhaled. Yet what? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Yet there is still a piece missing. We know the money was paid out fraudulently. But to whom? And why? A sharp knock at the door interrupted them. Poirot turned as the housekeeper, her face pale and drawn, stepped inside. "Sir," she said hesitantly, "I thought you should know. Something's been delivered. Just now. There was no messenger, just this. Left on the doorstep." She held out a small envelope. Poirot took it, weighing it carefully in his palm before breaking the seal. Inside was a single photograph, old and slightly faded. Poirot studied it intently. Hastings leaned in. "Who is it?" Poirot remained silent for a moment, then slowly turned the photograph so Hastings could see. The image was of two men shaking hands in front of a grand building. One was unmistakably Devonshire. The other Hastings sucked in a sharp breath. "That's the bank director." Poirot's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Ah, and now, Hastings, the picture begins to clear." He tapped the photograph gently. "You see, mon ami, sometimes the truth is hidden, not in what is missing, but in what has been overlooked. And I believe we are finally seeing the real story unfold." Poirot studied the photograph for a long moment, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the edge of the table. Hastings, his nerves already frayed, shifted impatiently beside him. "Poirot, are you going to tell me what this means, or must?" "I keep guessing." Poirot exhaled slowly, placing the photograph on the desk. "Mon ami, you see what is in front of you, but not what it signifies. This image, it is not merely a meeting between two men. It is a statement of intent. A bond forged not in friendship, but in necessity." Hastings frowned. "Necessity?" Poirot nodded. "Devonshire and the bank director, two men whose fates were entangled long before this case began." He reached for the ledger, his fingers turning the pages with care, stopping at an entry Hastings had seen before, but never considered with much importance. Poirot tapped the name listed. Charles Devonshire. The bank made payments to Devonshire over the years, under various pretexts. The sums were never exorbitant, but they were consistent to consistent. He was being paid for something. Hastings squinted at the numbers. "Are you saying the bank was bribing him?" Poirot shook his head. "Non, not bribing. Paying a debt. A debt that was not financial, but personal." Hastings sighed in frustration. "You're speaking in riddles, Poirot. What kind of debt?" Poirot steepled his fingers. "A debt of silence, Hastings." Hastings stiffened. "Blackmail?" A small smile curved Poirot's lips. "Enfin, now you are thinking, mon ami." He rose from his chair, pacing the room with deliberate steps. For years, Devonshire was receiving these quiet payments. The bank's director ensured they were disguised well enough to avoid scrutiny, but something changed. Recently, the amount increased significantly. Why? Hastings shook his head. Because the stakes were raised? Poirot nodded. Whatever leverage Devonshire had over the bank, it became a greater threat. Perhaps he demanded too much, or perhaps he grew reckless. But what is clear is that the director or someone within the bank decided it was no longer viable to keep him silent with money alone. Hastings' mouth went dry. You think they tried to get rid of him? Poirot gave a small, knowing nod. Consider Hastings. A bank does not pay a dead man. And yet, Devonshire's payment was processed after his supposed death. Why? Hastings thought for a moment. Because they needed to make it seem like he was still alive. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Exactament. They needed to buy time. Time to remove him permanently before any inquiries were made. But something went wrong. Devonshire vanished, but he did not die, not yet. Someone got to him before the banks. People did. Someone who saw an opportunity. Hastings frowned. Then who attacked the doctor? Poirot's expression darkened. Someone desperate to keep the truth from surfacing. The doctor knew too much. He had access to medical records. Perhaps even proof that Devonshire was alive. He was not attacked at random, he was silenced. Hastings felt a chill run through him. So we're dealing with more than just fraud. This is a cover-up one that involves murder. Poirot nodded solemnly. Yes, mon ami. And now the true question remains. What was Devonshire holding? Over the bank that made them willing to go to such extremes. Hastings hesitated, then his eyes widened. Wait, what if it wasn't about money at all? What if it was something else entirely? A secret the bank couldn't afford to have exposed. Poirot's expression grew thoughtful. Ah, Hastings, now you are very near the truth. The final piece of the puzzle, Devonshire's leverage, has yet to be revealed. But I suspect that, when we uncover it, we shall understand the full scale of this crime. His gaze drifted back to the photograph, his fingers resting lightly on its edge. Someone in this picture is more than just an accomplice. They are the orchestrator. Hastings swallowed. Then we're running out of time, Poirot. Because, whoever they are, they won't stop now. Poirot's eyes narrowed. No, mon ami. But neither shall we. The air in the dimly lit study was thick with tension. Poirot sat calmly at the desk, his fingertips lightly pressing together, his gaze unwavering as he observed the man across from him. Charles Devonshire's presence in this room was the final, irrefutable proof that the crime had not only been premeditated, but meticulously orchestrated. Yet, Devonshire was not the true architect of this scheme. He was merely a pawn, a man whose desperation had made him a liability. And the real villain had spent the past few weeks trying to erase him from existence, across from Poirot, the bank. Director Henry Alcott shifted uncomfortably in his chair. His jaw was tight, his fingers clasped together as though they could physically restrain the growing panic beneath his composed exterior. He had been summoned here under the pretense of discussing the latest developments in the case. What he did not realize was that Poirot had no intention of discussing anything, only of revealing Hastings, standing near the door, looked from Poirot to Alcott, barely containing his anticipation. Well, Poirot, he prompted, unable to bear the silence any longer. Poirot did not immediately answer. Instead, he reached for a small slip of paper on the desk and turned it toward Alcott. Monsieur, do you recognize this? Alcott leaned forward slightly, his eyes darting over the document. his lips pressed into a thin line. "It appears to be a financial record." "I don't see what this has to do with—" Poirot lifted a hand. "Cutting him off. You do not see, but I assure you I do." He tapped the paper lightly. "This is a record of the final payment made to Monsieur Devonshire. A payment issued after he was supposedly dead." Alcott's fingers twitched. "That must have been an administrative error." Poirot chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Oh, but you see, there was no error. This payment was intentional, a means to delay suspicion. But there was one flaw in your plan, monsieur." Alcott's breath was growing heavier, his shoulders slightly hunched. "Which was?" Poirot turned to Devonshire, whose gaunt face was lined with exhaustion and fear. "The flaw, monsieur, was that you underestimated the man you tried to silence." Devonshire lifted his gaze, his eyes hollow but defiant. "I was supposed to disappear, wasn't I? And if it weren't for your men botching their job, I would have—" He turned his attention to Alcott, who was now rigid in his chair. "You knew the moment I threatened to go public. You couldn't keep me on the payroll anymore. You had to get rid of me." Alcott scoffed, shaking his head. "This is absurd. I had nothing to do with his disappearance. The man's clearly been through an ordeal. Who's to say he even remembers things correctly?" Poirot smiled a small, knowing smile. "Ah, monsieur, you are most adept at deflection. But I have one final question for you. If you are not involved in the attempt on Devonshire's life, then tell me, why were you seen entering the warehouse near the docks 2 nights ago, the same warehouse where Devonshire was being held?" The color drained from Alcott's face. His mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Poirot's expression did not change. "You went to confirm he was dead," Poirot continued, his voice calm and unrelenting. "But you found something else, did you not? The realization that Devonshire had escaped. And from that moment on, monsieur, you are no longer erasing evidence. You are covering your own tracks." Alcott's hands clenched into fists. "You have no proof of this. None of what you're saying would hold up in a court of law." Poirot tilted his head slightly. "Perhaps not yet, monsieur, but I have something even more valuable." He gestured toward the door. It swung open, and 2 uniformed officers stepped inside. Between them stood a man Poirot had been expecting, the very man Alcott had thought was long gone. Hastings inhaled sharply. "The doctor. Ernest Langley," his forehead still bandaged from his attack, stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Alcott. "It was you," he said, his voice steady despite the lingering pain in his expression. "You tried to have me killed because I was the only one who knew the medical records had been altered. Devonshire was never dead, but you needed the world to believe he was." Alcott's composure finally cracked. His jaw clenched, his eyes darting toward the exit for the briefest second. Poirot saw it before the movement even happened, the telltale sign of a man about to make a final, desperate move. Before Alcott could bolt, one of the officers stepped forward, placing a firm hand on his shoulder. "I wouldn't if I were you." Alcott's entire body tensed. He was cornered, the pieces of his carefully constructed plan crumbling around him. Slowly, his shoulders sagged, his lips parted, and for a long moment he looked as if he might argue. But then something in him broke. His face twisted, frustration and resignation bleeding into one. "You don't understand," he muttered, shaking his head. "I had no choice." Poirot leaned forward. "Ah, monsieur, but you did. And that is what separates the guilty from the innocent. There is always a choice." Alcott exhaled shakily, his gaze flickering to Devonshire, then to the doctor, before finally landing on Poirot. His lips curled into a bitter smile. "Well played, detective." Poirot did not return the smile. He merely inclined his head as the officers led Alcott toward the door. Hastings exhaled, rubbing a hand down his face. "Well, Poirot, I must say I wasn't sure how this would end, but I never expected." He trailed off, shaking his head. Poirot stood, adjusting his cuffs. "Ah, Hastings, the truth is often a puzzle of its own. But in the end, it always reveals itself." Devonshire let out a heavy breath, his hands trembling slightly as he turned to Poirot. "And what happens to me?" Poirot studied him for a long moment before speaking. "That, monsieur, is for the law to decide. You have been both a victim and a participant in deception. But I believe there is one truth you must accept." Devonshire swallowed. "And what's that?" Poirot's eyes softened slightly. "That the past does not disappear simply because we wish it to. But sometimes facing it is the only way to move forward." With that, Poirot turned, the weight of the case finally lifting from his shoulders. Outside, the city hummed with life, unaware of the tangled web that had just been unraveled. But for Poirot, the case was closed. And the truth, however painful, had found its way into the light. As the night settled over London, Poirot allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. The case had reached its conclusion, or so it seemed. Alcott had been arrested. Devonshire was safe, but would have to answer for his own part in the deception, and the web of lies had been untangled. Justice, Poirot thought, had prevailed. But even as he sipped his tea in the quiet of his study, something nagged at him. A faint thread, barely visible, yet persistent in its presence. Hastings, reclining in a chair across from him, let out a long sigh. "Well, Poirot, I must say, this was one of your more impressive deductions. Though I admit, I'm glad it's over." He stretched, as if releasing the tension that had built up over the weeks. Poirot, however, did not respond. His fingers traced absent patterns against the rim of his cup. His eyes narrowed in thought. Hastings frowned. "Poirot, you're not still thinking about the case, are you?" Poirot inhaled slowly, setting his cup down with deliberate care. "Hastings, mon ami, have you ever felt that something was finished, and yet—" He gestured vaguely. A single note remained off-key. Hastings tilted his head. "You mean like when a song doesn't quite end where you expect it to?" "Precisely." Poirot tapped his temple. "Something remains unresolved. Something that does not sit well with me." Hastings frowned. But Alcott confessed grudgingly yes, but it was clear he was behind it all. "We have Devonshire's testimony, the financial records, the doctor's account. What else could there be?" Poirot leaned back in his chair, staring up at the ceiling as if the answer might be hidden in the cracks of the plaster. "Tell me, Hastings, why did Alcott make that final attempt to flee?" Hastings blinked. "Because he was caught." Poirot shook his head. "Non, mon ami. A man like Alcott, a financier, a strategist, would have known the game was lost the moment the evidence was laid before him. And yet, in those last moments, he was afraid. Not merely of being caught, but of something else. Something greater, Hastings." Sat up straighter. "You think someone else was pulling the strings?" Poirot's lips pressed into a thin line. "I think, Hastings, that Alcott was not the mastermind he appeared to be. He was competent, yes, ambitious, but true masterminds do not panic." And Alcott was terrified. A sharp knock at the door interrupted their conversation. Poirot's gaze flicked toward it, and he called out, "Enter." The door swung open to reveal Inspector Japp, his expression grim. He wasted no time with pleasantries. "Poirot, I hope you haven't settled into comfortably." Poirot gestured for him to continue. Japp stepped inside, closing the door behind him. "Alcott's dead." A heavy silence fell over the room. Hastings let out a sharp breath. "Dead? But how?" Japp's jaw was tight. "Poison. In his holding cell. The guards never saw anything. 1 minute he was fine. The next, gone." Poirot stood abruptly, his movements uncharacteristically sharp. "Murder?" Japp nodded grimly. "Looks that way. Which means someone wanted him silenced." Hastings paled. "But if Alcott wasn't the one in charge, then?" Poirot exhaled slowly, his mind already racing ahead. "Then the true villain is still free." Japp folded his arms. "I don't suppose you've got a theory, Poirot?" Poirot tapped his fingers against his chin. "No theory, Inspector, but a certainty." Japp raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and who might that be?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "The one who had the most to gain. The one who knew every step before we took it. The one who made sure Alcott remained. Useful until he was not." Hastings swallowed hard. "You mean?" Poirot turned, his voice quiet but firm. "The true mastermind has been watching us all along. And now, mon ami, we must catch them before they strike again." Poirot stood in the dimly lit corridor of Scotland Yard, his gaze fixed on the cold steel bars of Alcott's former cell. The poison had done its work quickly, too quickly. A man as careful as Alcott would have anticipated every possibility. Yet he had not foreseen his own demise. No, this was not his doing. It was the work of someone who had planned for every contingency, someone who knew exactly when to cut the strings of their puppet. Hastings shifted uncomfortably beside him. "Poirot, it's chilling, really, the way this happened. Whoever's behind this, they don't just eliminate threats, they erase them." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "Exactement, mon ami. And that tells us something very important." Japp, standing with arms folded, let out a frustrated sigh. "All right, Poirot, I'll bite. What does it tell us?" Poirot turned away from the cell, his sharp gaze landing on the inspector. "That the true villain does not take risks. They did not leave Alcott to face trial because Alcott, under the right pressure, might have spoken. This was not just a murder, it was a message. A final stroke to ensure their plan remained intact. Japp shook his head. That's all well and good, but we've got nothing left to go on. The one suspect who could have led us to the real mastermind is dead. Poirot's lips curled slightly. Oh, but that is where you are mistaken, my friend. There is always something left behind. He stepped toward the desk where Alcott's final belongings had been collected. A neatly folded handkerchief. A pocket. Watch. A single scrap of paper with numbers scrawled hastily in the margin. Poirot picked it up, examining the smudged ink. What is it? Hastings asked. Poirot held it up. A phone number. Incomplete, yet familiar. He turned to Japp. Inspector, I require the records of visitors Alcott received in the last 2 weeks. Japp frowned. You think someone came to see him in person? Poirot nodded. Whoever orchestrated this would have ensured Alcott remained compliant. A final visit to remind him of the consequences should he speak, Japp called. For the files, and within moments, a list was produced. As Poirot scanned the names, his finger paused over one. Hastings peered over his shoulder. Lord Whitmore? His brow furrowed. But he was a victim in all this, wasn't he? Poirot smiled slightly. Victim, yes, but also something more. Japp's eyes widened. You're saying he was behind it? Poirot set the file down. Think Mon Cher, who stood to gain the most from all of this. Alcott was merely the middleman, the one who pulled the financial strings. But who ensured the deception continued? Who had the influence, the wealth, and the means to silence anyone who came too close? Hastings looked troubled, but Whitmore nearly lost everything. Why would he stage his own downfall? Poirot steepled his fingers. Because, Hastings, a man who truly loses everything has nothing left to protect. And Lord Whitmore, he was never in danger at all. Japp exhaled sharply. You're saying it was all a performance? That he let us believe he was another pawn when, in reality, he was moving the pieces. Poirot nodded. And now, my friends, we must set the final trap. The Whitmore estate loomed ahead, its grand façade bathed in moonlight. Poirot and Hastings entered the drawing-room, where Lord Whitmore stood waiting. He greeted them with a weary smile, offering a seat by the fire. Gentlemen, he said smoothly, pouring himself a brandy. I assume this is not a social visit. Poirot settled into the chair, his sharp eyes never leaving Whitmore's face. Indeed not, Lord Whitmore. We come with news of Alcott. Whitmore's hand paused on the glass for a fraction of a second, before he took a measured sip. Ah, yes. A dreadful tragedy, indeed, Poirot agreed. A man with such intelligence, such cunning, one would think he could have seen his own downfall coming. Whitmore exhaled, shaking his head. Genius and arrogance often go hand in hand. Poirot leaned forward slightly. Just as they do with you, Lord Whitmore. A beat of silence passed. Whitmore raised an eyebrow. I beg your pardon? Poirot tilted his head. Oh, Come now. Must we continue the game? It is over, I assure you. Alcott was your shield, but you were always the architect. The financial discrepancies were too perfect, the deception too meticulous. Only someone with true power could have controlled both Alcott and the aftermath of his arrest. Whitmore's expression remained unreadable. That's a rather bold accusation, Poirot. Poirot smiled. Bold, perhaps, but true. He reached into his pocket, producing the scrap of paper with the half-written number. Alcott tried to reach someone before his death. A final attempt to call his benefactor, perhaps? Unfortunately, he did not finish writing the number, but I recognized the pattern. It belongs to a direct line to your private estate. Whitmore's fingers tightened around his glass, but he said nothing. Japp stepped forward. We've got enough to detain. You, Lord Whitmore, for the first time. A flicker of something crossed Whitmore's face. Not fear, but resignation. He exhaled, setting his glass down. Clever Poirot. I should have expected nothing less. Hastings swallowed. Then, it's true? Whitmore stood, adjusting his cuffs with careful precision. Let us say that in matters of power, some sacrifices are necessary. Poirot's expression hardened. You sacrificed many, Lord Whitmore. But in the end, it is you who is lost. Japp stepped forward, producing the handcuffs. Whitmore did not resist. As they led him away, Hastings let out a long breath. Well, that's that, then. Poirot gazed into the fire, his voice soft. Perhaps Hastings frowned. You don't seem satisfied, Poirot sighed. Justice has been served, mon ami. But tell me, does it ever truly feel complete? Hastings had no answer. And in the silence that followed, Poirot let the weight of the case settle into his bones, knowing that, for all the victories in the world, some shadows would never fully disappear. As Poirot stepped out of the Whitmore estate, the night air was thick with the scent of damp earth. The case was closed, the culprit in custody, and yet a peculiar weight still pressed against his thoughts. Justice had been served, or so it seemed, but Poirot had long since learned that finality was a luxury seldom afforded in his line of work. Hastings trailed beside him, hands tucked into his coat pockets, his breath visible in the cold. You're doing that thing again, Poirot, he said after a moment. Poirot arched a brow. Quelle chose, mon ami? Hastings sighed. That thing where the case is solved, but you're still thinking. Brooding even, Poirot smiled faintly. Brooding, non. Reflecting, perhaps. Hastings stopped in his tracks. Well, what is it now? We caught the real villain. Whitmore confessed, didn't he? Ah, yes, Poirot murmured. A confession given not with desperation, nor regret, but with acceptance. Hastings frowned. What are you getting at? Poirot's eyes gleamed. Consider Hastings. A man like Whitmore, orchestrating such a meticulous crime, eliminating loose ends with precision. And yet, when confronted, he did not protest, did not bargain, did not even attempt an escape. Hastings shifted uncomfortably. Maybe he knew the game was up, or, Poirot countered, perhaps he knew the game was already won. A chill that had nothing to do with the night air settled over Hastings. But that doesn't make sense. He's going to prison. Poirot remained silent for a moment, gazing out over the fog-laden streets. Then, almost absently, he reached into his pocket, retrieving the scrap of paper, the half-written number Alcott had been attempting to dial before his untimely death. "We assumed this was Whitmore's private line," Poirot said, turning the paper over in his fingers. But Alcott never finished writing it. Hastings' frown deepened. "You think he was calling someone else?" Poirot's expression darkened. "If so, that someone remains in the shadows. And they have been watching us all along." A sudden gust of wind lifted the edges of Poirot's coat as he turned sharply on his heel. "Come, Hastings. There is one last visit we must make." The address they sought was tucked away on the outskirts of London, a quiet manor shrouded in mist. The kind of place one would overlook, precisely because it was designed to be forgotten. Poirot's knock was answered by a butler, his face impassive as he stepped aside to admit them. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old books and pipe smoke. A fire crackled in the grand hearth, casting flickering shadows along the richly paneled walls. And there, seated in a high-backed chair, was a figure Poirot had not expected to meet again. Sir Edmund Holloway, a man of influence, a whisper in high circles, and someone who, until this moment, had been nothing more than a background presence in their investigation. He smiled faintly, swirling a glass of brandy in one hand. "Monsieur Poirot," he said smoothly, "I must say I expected you sooner." Hastings stiffened. "Then you knew we'd come?" Holloway exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Of course. You're not the sort to leave a puzzle unsolved." Poirot's gaze sharpened. "And yet, you are kind enough to leave one last piece for me to find." Holloway took a slow sip of his brandy. "Consider it." An invitation. Hastings glanced between them. "What are you playing at?" Holloway set his glass down with a quiet clink. Whitmore was always meant to fall. He was useful, but replaceable. A man of his ambition would have eventually overreached. It was only a matter of time before someone needed to sweep the board clean. Poirot's expression remained unreadable. "And that someone was you." Holloway inclined his head slightly. "One does what is necessary to maintain order." Hastings bristled. "Order?" "People were murdered." Holloway's gaze didn't waver. "And how many more would have suffered had the corruption continued unchecked?" "Whitmore was a disease. I simply administered the cure." Poirot regarded him for a long moment. "And what of Alcott? Did he outlive his usefulness as well?" Holloway's smile did not reach his eyes. "Alcott was weak. He panicked. In this game, there is no room for weak players." Hastings clenched his fists. "You're just as guilty as Whitmore." Holloway's expression remained calm. "And yet, Inspector Japp has no evidence against me. No motive to tie me to the crimes. No loose ends." He leaned forward slightly. "You're a brilliant man, Poirot. But even you must see that justice is not always a matter of law. Sometimes it is simply a matter of perspective." Poirot remained still, his gaze unreadable. Then, with a small nod, he stood. Come, Hastings. There is nothing more to be gained here. Hastings looked at him incredulously. You're just going to let him go? Poirot gave a small, knowing smile. For now, Holloway watched them with mild amusement as they turned to leave. A pleasure as always, Poirot. Until next time. Poirot did not look back. Outside, the mist had thickened, curling around the street lamps like ghostly fingers. Hastings exhaled sharply. I don't like this, Poirot. That man, he's dangerous, Poirot nodded. Yes, Hastings. He is Hastings. Hesitated. But if we can't prove anything, Poirot placed a hand on his friend's shoulder. Patience, mon ami. The game is not over. It has merely changed. Hastings looked at him uncertainly. So what now? Poirot smiled faintly, the flicker of a challenge in his eyes. Now we wait, and when the next move is made, we shall be ready. The fog swallowed their footsteps as they walked into the night, leaving behind the embers of one mystery and the promise of another.